Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 23 on urogenital system infections. In this chapter, we are going to be covering infections of both the urinary system and the reproductive system, including both male and female anatomy. And we cover these systems together because, in particular in males, the two systems are tied together quite closely. So let's take a look first at the urinary system. The urinary system consists of two kidneys that are responsible for filtering your blood, as well as two ureters from which urine will drain out of the kidneys to the bladder, and then the urethra is the channel through which that urine will ultimately pass out of the body. The reproductive systems differ depending upon whether you're looking at a male or female anatomy. In the male anatomy, the urinary system is tied up with the reproductive system in that the urethra serves to excrete both urine as well as semen as it passes from the testes through the vas deferens and out through the urethra. In the female anatomy, the vagina is the major opening that connects to the cervix, which is the lower part of the uterus up here. Also connected to the uterus are the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, that lead from the ovaries on either side. The role that normal microbiota play in the urogenital system is especially important for females because the vagina is primarily colonized by lactic acid producing bacteria that maintain an acidic pH that inhibits many invading species. And so this acidic pH, when disrupted, as we will see as we go through some of these infections, can give rise to opportunistic pathogens that will take over in the absence of sufficient lactic acid producing bacteria and sufficiently low pH levels. As far as the urinary system goes, below the kidneys, the urinary system is not sterile, contrary to popular belief, and does contain a microbiome, although that microbiome is not well characterized as of yet. We do know that in women at least, the urinary microbiome seems to be very similar to the vaginal microbiome in terms of what species it contains. In fact, there is some evidence that lactic acid producing bacteria also play a role in competitively excluding pathogens in the urinary tract. And there are some initial studies that indicate that lactobacillus has an inhibitory role at preventing urinary tract infections. In this study, there was a placebo-controlled phase 2 trial of administering Lactobacillus crispatus as a probiotic to determine whether this would have an effect on preventing urinary tract infections, and in fact it did. So we're first going to take a look at diseases of the urinary system and then move on to diseases of the reproductive system. And the two diseases of the urinary system we will examine are cystitis and pyelonephritis. Both of these are most often bacterial in origin. It's possible that other agents can infect the urinary system, but bacteria are by far the most common cause of urinary diseases. Cystitis is inflammation of the urinary bladder, and by far it is usually caused by E. coli, Escherichia coli, which we know is a normal member of our digestive microbiome. It's found in the intestines. And this is one reason why E. coli is the main pathogen that causes cystitis, and why this disease is more common in females as compared to males. Because females have a much shorter urethra than men, on average 2 inches as compared to 8 inches in men. And the female opening of the urethra is also closer to the anus than in men. And so there are more opportunities for cross-contamination, and it's a shorter route for pathogens to get from the opening of the urethra to the urinary bladder in women compared to men. And so with E. coli being one of the main fecal bacteria, it makes sense that there is a cross-contamination that is a higher risk for females than males. It's characterized by dysuria, which is the technical term for difficult, painful urination, pyuria, which is pus in the urine, and hematuria, which is blood in the urine. The way that cystitis or UTI is usually diagnosed is through a urine culture that exhibits over 1,000 colony-forming units per milliliter, as well as with a leukocyte esterase test. So you may remember back in our first unit when we talked about quantifying bacterial growth by taking a sample of urine and culturing it on a plate and performing serial dilutions to determine the exact concentration of bacteria per milliliter. It can be determined whether the concentration meets this threshold beyond which an infection is indicated. The leukocyte esterase test actually doesn't test for the pathogen itself. It tests for the presence of an enzyme that is produced by neutrophils, one of our main leukocytes or white blood cells. And if it is indicative of neutrophils having a presence in the urinary bladder, then this is indicative that our immune system is trying to fight an infection there. So a combination of these two tests is usually used to diagnose a UTI. Unfortunately, antibiotic resistance is on the rise among pathogens that cause urinary tract infections. At the time of this recording, an estimated 1 in 3 UTIs taking place in young, healthy women who have no other complications are resistant to Bactrim, which is typically the first line of defense against UTIs. And it's a sulfa drug, so it's a synthetic antibiotic. In addition, 1 in 5 urinary tract infection pathogens are resistant to other antibiotics. So this problem of antibiotic resistance that we've talked about before is making UTIs more difficult to treat. Next, we have pyelonephritis. This is inflammation of one or both of the kidneys that usually develops from the progression of an untreated UTI. So if someone has a UTI that is not addressed, then the infection can spread and progress up to the kidneys, and this is a much more serious type of infection. It's characterized by a fever, pain in the side or the back that is radiating from the kidney itself, as well as kidney damage. It can also be deadly if it progresses to sepsis and is not treated expediently. Once again, E. coli causes the disease in 75% of cases, which makes sense because E. coli is the typical pathogen that causes urinary tract infections. And this is diagnosed with a urine culture exhibiting much higher concentrations of bacteria, over 100,000 colony-forming units per milliliter on a plate. So now let's take a look at a checkpoint. So what you see here is a cartoon of a serial dilution of an original culture. And imagine that this serial dilution is performed on a urine culture. Which do the results indicate? Do they reach the threshold for cystitis, or do they reach the threshold for pyelonephritis? And what you want to look at is this last serial dilution, the one that has 2 colonies here on the plate. Calculate what the concentration is per milliliter, and then determine whether or not that counts as cystitis or pyelonephritis. This brings us now to diseases of the reproductive systems. Here we have a wider variety of categories of microbes that are usually at play. So we have some bacterial diseases as well as viral, fungal, and protozoan diseases. We're going to start with the bacterial diseases, the first of which is gonorrhea. The cause of this disease is a gram-negative Diplococcus-shaped pathogen called Neisseria gonorrhoeae. It can not only infect the urogenital system, but it can also infect the eyes, the rectum, the mouth and pharynx, and so it's a pathogen that can be spread to other systems of the body through direct contact as well. 60% of cases of gonorrhea occur in individuals who are aged between 15 and 24, so it's a disease that is mostly transmitted among young people. It also manifests differently in men as compared to women from a variety of different standpoints and metrics. Men have a 20 to 35% chance of transmitting the pathogen per exposure. or rather catching the pathogen per exposure, I should say. And it infects in men the urethra, resulting in painful urination and discharge from the urethra that contains pus. In women, there's a 60 to 90% chance of it being transmitted to them per exposure. And instead of infecting the urethra, it typically infects the cervix, which is what you can see here in this image. This is an infected cervix. But it often produces few symptoms. And this is problematic because it can lead to a lack of recognition of the disease, and that can lead to later complications, such as the development of pelvic inflammatory syndrome, which we'll talk about shortly. So testing is important to determine if gonorrhea is present because prolonged infections can spread outside of the genitourinary system and move to other organs and body parts such as the heart, brain, eyes, and joints. Obviously, the disease becomes much more serious when that is the case and even life-threatening. In women, as I said, it can progress to pelvic inflammatory disease, which has other complications associated with it. The other thing that's troubling about gonorrhea is that adaptive immunity does not develop, meaning that your body doesn't retain an immunological memory of the pathogen. And the reason why is still being studied, but it's thought to be due to a combination of antigenic variation exhibited by this pathogen and a mechanism that it uses for suppressing your cell-mediated immune system's response. Men are typically diagnosed with a Gram stain of the discharge from the urethra, and women are typically diagnosed by culturing the bacterium on a enriched selective media, particularly chocolate agar, which is what you see down here. Like urinary tract infections, gonorrhea is also becoming untreatable as a result of the rise of antibiotic resistance. In general, it's trickier to treat because it is a gram-negative pathogen, and there are fewer options as far as antibiotics go that are available for treating gram-negative pathogens. Cephalosporins are the current recommended treatment, but these are already becoming obsolete due to the rise of antibiotic resistance. So in this checkpoint here, I have 3 samples of Gram stains, and I want you to identify for me either A, B, or C which one of these samples might be Neisseria gonorrhoeae. Our next infection is Nongonococcalurethritis. And this sounds like quite a mouthful, but if we break it down, what it really means is to be non-gonococcal means that it's not caused by Neisseria gonorrhoeae, and it's urethritis, so it's inflammation of the urethra. This disease doesn't fit really neatly into the category of a urinary disease or a reproductive disease because it does infect the urethra, but in women it also infects the cervix and it's transmitted sexually. So the most common causes of this infection include chlamydia trachomatis, which we've seen before, but also less commonly Mycoplasma genitalium and Ureaplasma ureolyticum. And just another note on that, the most common pathogen, chlamydia, is not only the most common cause of non-gonococcal urethritis, but it's the most common sexually transmitted infection in the United States, period. And one reason why is because it is often unrecognized. In men, symptoms are mild, and up to 50% are unaware of the infection. In women, most are asymptomatic, and up to 70% are unaware of the infection. So this is obviously a problem because if you're not aware, you don't get tested, and then it can be transmitted to another partner. In women, it also can progress to pelvic inflammatory disease and become much more dangerous as well. Before we talk about pelvic inflammatory disease, though, I have one more checkpoint for you. Because as I said, we've seen this chlamydia trachomatis pathogen before in our discussion of other body systems. So tell me, what's one other body system that can be infected by this same organism, and how is the pathogen transmitted in the case of that disease? So now that we've talked about these diseases, it's time to elaborate a little bit on pelvic inflammatory disease. Pelvic inflammatory disease is this catch-all term for an advanced infection of the female pelvic organs, meaning the uterus, cervix, and ovaries. And it's most commonly caused by N. gonorrhoeae and Chlamydia trachomatis, but other microbes may also be involved. Essentially, pelvic inflammatory disease is what arises when an untreated sexually transmitted infection with one of these pathogens progresses and moves to other parts of the reproductive system, which can cause major issues. But the most dangerous form of pelvic inflammatory disease is called salpingitis. And this is where the infection localizes in the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes, and it's particularly severe because that infection of the fallopian tubes can cause scarring that can lead to sterility. Because the fallopian tubes are the tube through which the eggs will pass out of the ovaries on their way to the uterus. So, scarring can block that from happening, and it can also lead to a life threatening ectopic pregnancy, which is what happens when a egg is fertilized and transforms into an embryo somewhere outside of the uterus, for example, in the fallopian tube itself, due to scarring that causes that egg to be blocked. And as this ectopic pregnancy develops, it can cause the fallopian tube to rupture, and it can be life-threatening to the mother because then it can lead to massive internal hemorrhaging. So pelvic inflammatory disease is treatable, but the longer a woman has it, the more likely scarring is to occur. So it's important to address it early, and in particular to address sexually transmitted infections before they even progress to the point of being pelvic inflammatory disease. Next, we have syphilis. So syphilis is caused by a gram-negative spirochete. We haven't heard a lot about spirochetes up until now, but you may remember that this is the morphological type of bacteria that has this corkscrew formation. The name of the species that causes this infection is Treponema pallidum. And the spirochete morphology is actually important for its virulence because the corkscrew formation allows the Treponema pallidum pathogens to sort of swim and wiggle through the fluid between cells and tissues. And so, from its first exposure to the mucous membranes of the genitals, the pathogen will enter the blood and then it will find its way to other body tissues to cause a systemic infection. When syphilis develops, it moves through 3 distinct stages that present quite differently from one another. The primary stage is the first stage that typically appears about 3 weeks post-exposure, but this can vary anywhere between 10 and 90 days. And it usually resolves itself within weeks, but the presentation looks like the appearance of this sore called a hard chancre at the site of the infection. It's filled with fluid, but it is painless. And so it can often go unnoticed if it's found, for example, on the cervix or the anus. In men, it can often be found on the penis, but in women, it is often found in the cervix, and because it is painless, it may not be apparent that that sore is there. And so this stage, if it is unrecognized, will then progress to the secondary stage. The secondary stage is characterized by the appearance of highly infectious and contagious sores in the mucous membranes of the mouth, and that form a rash on the skin, in particular on the palms of the hand, as you can see right here, and on the soles of the feet. It's also accompanied by a fever, swelling of the lymph nodes, and a general feeling of malaise. And this stage lasts 2 to 6 weeks, after which the disease enters a latent period. During this period, a person is asymptomatic and often not contagious. However, they still retain the pathogen in their bodies. And this stage can last many years. 75% of cases do not progress past this point, and if latency persists for 2 to 4 years, then often contagiousness is permanently lost. However, in 25% of cases, the tertiary stage arises after 10 to 20 years of latency. The tertiary stage is characterized by gumas, which are large rubbery masses of tissue that develop on the skin, mucous membranes, organs, and even sometimes the bones. And so these lesions, depending upon where they develop, can be life-threatening. Particularly when they occur in the heart, they can result in something called cardiovascular syphilis that can be deadly. And also when they occur in the brain, they can cause neurosyphilis that can lead to dementia, seizures, paralysis, loss of the senses, etc. When they occur in the eyes, it can lead to blindness. To this day, the recommended treatment for syphilis is penicillin, which is the first antibiotic ever discovered back in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. And so penicillin has been around for a long time, and despite this, it is still the primary antibiotic recommended for treating syphilis, which is why it was unconscionable that an experiment was undertaken for nearly 40 years that denied Black men who were infected with syphilis and didn't know it from accessing penicillin that would cure them in what is now known as the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. And so you may have heard of the Tuskegee study before, but I'm going to link a video below in the description where you can learn more about this study and one of the most flagrant examples of breaching medical ethics in the United States history. Another thing to point out about syphilis is that since about the turn of the century, it has been on the rise in the United States. Syphilis rates dropped dramatically through the 90s, but then since then, over the past few decades, the rates have been creeping up again. And it's unclear why this is the case, but it's important to realize that this is happening with syphilis, and that public awareness for getting tested and getting treatment for sexually transmitted infections is known. Now that you've learned about the stages of syphilis, tell me in which stage the disease is most likely to be communicated or transmitted to someone else. The next bacterial disease that we have is chancroid. This is caused by a gram-negative bacillus-shaped bacterium called Haemophilus ducreyi. As you can see, the bacilli are arranged in chains down here. And this infection presents as soft, swollen genital ulcers that may produce highly contagious discharge and also spread to infect the lymph nodes, which causes swelling in the lymph nodes around the groin. This disease is not common in tropical regions, especially in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And our final bacterial disease is bacterial vaginosis. This disease is caused, it causes inflammation of the vagina due to infection with a possibility of a variety of different pathogens, but most often it's caused by Gardnerella vaginalis. The result of this disease is that a vaginal pH of over 4.5 is indicated, accompanied by a fishy odor, white to yellow discharge that specifically contains clue cells. And clue cells are shed cells of the vaginal epithelial lining that are covered in a biofilm comprised mostly of Gardnerella vaginalis. So right here we can see in this microscopy image, the upper cell is a clue cell, and you can see the biofilm of bacteria on the surface. Down below, this is a normal cell. Unlike the other infections that we have looked at, bacterial vaginosis is not necessarily sexually transmitted. Instead, it's thought to originate opportunistically when the normal microbiota of the vagina, namely the lactobacilli, due to a variety of causes. This can include broad-spectrum antibiotic treatment. It can include the hormonal changes that accompany pregnancy, as well as diabetes. All of these diminish the normal lactobacilli in the vagina and make it possible for other members of the microbiome, particularly Gardnerella vaginalis, to opportunistically take over. This pathogen can be sexually transmitted and communicated from person to person, but it also is a normal member of the microbiome, and so bacterial vaginosis can arise without any sort of sexual transmission. Cultures are not a good way to diagnose this infection for that reason, because Gardnerella vaginalis is part of the normal microbiome, and so it can be isolated from women who are healthy as well as ones that are affected by bacterial vaginosis. So this brings us to the conclusion of our look at bacterial infections of the reproductive system. And now we're going to move on to our viral infections, which include herpes and genital warts. As we've seen before, we talked about herpes when we covered skin infections, and we saw that it's caused by herpes simplex virus 1 and 2, which are abbreviated HSV1 and HSV2 respectively. And we also saw that genital herpes is more often caused by HSV2. However, it can be caused by HSV1. Both of these viruses can infect either the oral mucous membranes or the genital mucous membranes, but more commonly HSV2 is localized around the genitals. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that 12.1% of the United States population is infected with HSV2, most of them asymptomatically. Among people who are symptomatic, the disease presents as lesions that cause a burning sensation, and they develop into these fluid-filled vesicles that cause painful urination and can often be painful when coming into contact with clothing. Herpes is a disease that causes a permanent latent infection of the nerve cells, and this means that there can be recurring outbreaks of these lesions. 90% of HSV2 infections lead to recurring outbreaks, whereas only 50% of HSV1 infections lead to recurring outbreaks. While we're on the topic of herpes, we also need to talk about neonatal herpes. Because while genital herpes is a disease that is more of an annoyance rather than a serious health threat to someone who is affected by it, neonatal herpes is a serious threat to neonates. Because herpes simplex virus can cross the placenta and result in pregnancy loss or severe neurological damage to a fetus. The effects occur when a primary herpes infection is acquired during pregnancy. A woman who already has a herpes infection very rarely passes the infection on to the fetus through the placenta because her body has already generated antibodies against that infection. And so this is really a major concern only when a woman acquires her first primary herpes infection while pregnant. Infants that are affected by untreated neonatal herpes have a 40% survival rate. So it's important to recognize this disease and treat it because the untreated survival rate is very poor. Herpes can also be transmitted to a newborn during delivery if sores are present at that time. However, there are medications that can be used to ensure that a woman is not contagious and not shedding viruses at the time of delivery. The other viral infection that we're going to talk about is genital warts. We've talked about warts before, again, when we covered skin infections, But genital warts are skin and mucous membranes growth specifically in the genital region caused by papillomavirus. 90% of these cases resolve within 2 years and are not considered a serious health threat to the individual who is affected, except in cases where the strain of human papillomavirus is an oncogenic or a cancer-causing one. There are well over 100 different strains of papillomavirus, and 14 have been identified as cancer-causing. Type 16 and 18 in particular are the cause of 70% of cases of cervical cancer. These strains can also cause oral, anal, and penile cancer. And this is the reason why a vaccine called Gardasil was developed to protect against human papillomavirus. Gardasil 9 protects against 9 of the most virulent types, but of course it does not protect against all of them, given that there are well over 100 strains of HPV. So we're almost to the end now of this lecture. We have one fungal disease and one protozoan disease to talk about left. That fungal disease is Candidiasis. Candidiasis is an opportunistic infection caused by members of the genus Candida, most often Candida albicans, which is a normal member of the vaginal microbiome, but it can arise into the form of an infection after the normal vaginal microbiome consisting of bacilli, lactobacilli specifically, is diminished through, as we've said before, broad-spectrum antibiotic therapy, pregnancy, and diabetes. Signs and symptoms of candidiasis include itching and thick, yellow, odorless discharge. Lastly, we have the protozoan infection, Trichomoniasis. This is caused by a flagellated protozoan called Trichomonas vaginalis, which you can see in this microscopy image right here. It too is often part of the normal female vaginal microbiome as well as the male urethral microbiome. But like candidiasis, it can overgrow if the normal vaginal microbiome is disrupted. Signs and symptoms include itching, irritation, and large amounts of greenish-yellow odorous discharge. And it is diagnosed typically by microscopy of the discharge, although it can be difficult to identify the pathogen under these circumstances, so the preferred method is sometimes a DNA test to determine whether the genetics of the pathogen are present. We have one final checkpoint here for you. I want you to name at least 2 diseases that are precipitated by a disruption of the normal vaginal conditions. We've talked about a variety throughout this lecture. And once you're finished with this checkpoint, you are finished with Chapter 23.